Manufacturing hearing to order. And good morning, and thank you all for your time this morning and for your attention to a very important topic. I called for this hearing today because I'm committed to fighting the deadly fentanyl epidemic on all fronts. The United States is facing the worst drug crisis in history, with a majority of overdose deaths caused by fentanyl. And while we talk about these drugs in a more global sense, make no mistake, this has very real impacts on people's lives. Too many kitchen tables have an empty chair because of this scourge, and I will leave no stone unturned to end it. In recent years, fentanyl has killed thousands of Wisconsinites, devastating families and communities in every part of my state. I've heard from mothers who lost children, cops and paramedics on the front lines, and advocates all demanding that we do more to end this crisis. And I know my colleagues hear the same resounding message in their states. This Congress, we took a step in the right direction when we passed bipartisan legislation to crack down on precursor chemical suppliers in China and drug cartels in Mexico that are producing these drugs and fueling this epidemic. But there is more work to do. We must make sure we are putting every resource possible toward protecting Americans and stopping the movement of deadly illicit substances across our border. In today's threat environment, malign actors ship precursor chemicals from China to ports in the Western Hemisphere. Upon arrival, criminal organizations process these chemicals into drugs, including the synthetic opioid fentanyl, that transit through the continent and devastate communities. We are also increasingly seeing fentanyl-laced cocaine or other substances moving through our hemisphere, causing a dramatic rise in fatalities. The fentanyl crisis demands a whole-of-government effort. The families I work for expect that all law enforcement and armed forces are working in lockstep. And today we are examining the role of the United States Coast Guard. One of the Coast Guard's statutory missions is drug interdiction. Historically, this mission has been focused on cocaine, the primary illicit narcotic shipped via maritime transportation. In recent years, the Coast Guard has demonstrated the ability to play a role in the tracking and removal of fentanyl and its precursor chemicals. Given the crisis in our country, we need to substantially increase this effort, and I look forward to hearing recommendations from our witnesses. The United States Coast Guard gathers intelligence, contributes assets, and conducts boardings of vessels of interest to identify, seize, or destroy illicit substances, primarily consisting of cocaine, methamphetamines, or heroin. The Coast Guard also contributes sea, air, and personnel assets to the joint interagency task forces to assist in tracking shipments of precursor chemicals and referring them to law enforcement and other partners for action. Today, I hope to hear about the Coast Guard's role in disrupting the fentanyl supply chain and opportunities to expand the Coast Guard's operational and intelligence capabilities to stop global drug movement. Part of improving our approach means ensuring that the Coast Guard has the needed resources and tools at their disposal. Transnational criminal organizations have dramatically increased the quantity of cocaine they are smuggling through maritime routes, yet we have seen a decline in cocaine removals at the same time. The Coast Guard is devoting fewer assets to the drug interdiction mission due to competing priorities and resource constraints. We must align sufficient resources to this mission so that we can stop cocaine shipments on water, where they are shipped in bulk quantities before they reach land and become much more difficult to interdict. At the same time, the Coast Guard is experiencing acquisition delays, the most notable of which is the 4-year delay in the offshore patrol cutter procurement program. I am concerned that we are not seizing every opportunity we can to stop precursor chemicals while they are being shipped from China. And finally, I'm concerned about our most valuable asset, our people. As a part of my commitment to keeping Americans safe from illicit substances, I want to identify ways to protect our Coast Guard men and women and the maritime public from exposure to dangerous drugs or chemicals during the course of their regular Coast Guard duties. I am therefore including in this year's Coast Guard Authorization Act a provision that would require all Coast Guard teams to carry naloxone or other opioid antagonists. In addition, the Coast Guard is currently 10% short of its enlisted workforce and has missed recruiting goals from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2023. This personnel shortage is felt across the services and impacts every mission, including causing the closure of 3 seasonal stations in the state of Wisconsin. The Coast Guard has laid up ships before their expected retirement date because there are not enough people to operate them. That means we have fewer ships to execute Coast Guard missions, including the critical counter-drug mission. It is imperative that the Coast Guard addresses workforce recruitment and retention challenges, and that includes enacting reforms to ensure that the Coast Guard is a safe environment to work in, an environment that does not allow sexual harassment or sexual assault. In addition, efforts to improve the culture of the services, the Coast Guard must do more to keep its commitment to members, and that commitment includes access to quality and affordable housing, medical care, and child care. It's important to note that these impacts are particularly severe for junior enlisted families, the very ranks we need most today. I am working to include provisions in the Coast Guard Authorization Act that support these quality of life concerns because we want to help the Coast Guard attract and retain a qualified and dedicated workforce. We owe the American public nothing short of the most exhaustive effort to stem the flow of deadly substances into our country. I am now going to call upon our witnesses today. Ranking Member Sullivan is on his way and will be recognized for his opening statement when he arrives. But we will hear from the witnesses and they will speak in order of rank: Admiral Lunde, Rear Admiral Burdian, Rear Admiral Little, and then Ms. McLoud. I thank you in advance for your opening statements and recognize Admiral Lunde.
Good morning, Chair Baldwin, members of the committee. Chair, I request that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Agreed.
Thank you, Chair Baldwin. Thank you for inviting me to appear for you before today to discuss Coast Guard drug interdiction and enforcement operations. And thank you for your enduring and strong support for the Coast Guard and our men and women, these young sentinels who have dedicated themselves to serve our nation. They are the best from across our great United States, and I'm incredibly proud to serve with them. Today, our service is in greater demand than ever before by the American people. First, for the operations we conduct across the United States and in U.S. territories, protecting and defending our borders, and through counter-drug operations and other operations, and our marine transportation system that's made up of our ports and waterways that are so vital to U.S. economic prosperity and national security, and also for the Coast Guard's increasing global presence in Latin America, the Arctic, and the Indo-Pacific, and in other places where our authorities, capabilities, and our operations make us a trusted and reliable partner across the interagency and with our allies and other nations who share our values. The Coast Guard provides a unique and enduring value to the American people. Central to the Coast Guard's missions are our maritime drug interdiction and enforcement operations. Transnational criminal organizations are highly sophisticated and finance criminal cartels that operate across national boundaries, smuggling drugs into the United States. Cartels operating in Mexico receive the majority of cocaine sourced from Colombia and Ecuador and move it on transshipment routes through the Eastern Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea for further transshipment to the United States. Cocaine and other plant-based narcotics remain a mainstay of these criminal cartels, but as you noted, Chair Baldwin, they are also engaged in the manufacture and smuggling of deadly fentanyl into the United States, principally across the land ports of entry. They also engage in human trafficking and weapons smuggling. This not only harms the United States, it also creates security challenges and destabilizes other nations in the region. And that fuels conditions that increase human insecurity, and it spurs irregular migration that threaten our U.S. border. The Coast Guard conducts drug interdiction and enforcement at sea where the cartels are most vulnerable and where we have the advantage. We do this with at-sea presence of our major cutters, boats, and aircraft, and our specialized law enforcement teams. We don't do it alone. We work closely with the Department of Defense, represented here by Admiral Burdian and Admiral Little, with DHS partners like DHS Joint Task Force East, Customs and Border Protection, and Homeland Security Investigations, and along with the Departments of Justice, including DEA and the Department of State. We work with allies and partner nations, sharing threat intelligence information and conducting combined operations at sea in the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean. Over the past decade, illicit trade in fentanyl and other synthetic drugs has surpassed cocaine as the most dangerous threat to the American people. And we remain focused on any movement of drugs that are coming toward the U.S. and stopping that movement. Although we haven't seen yet significant amounts of fentanyl smuggled in non-commercial means by sea, we remain vigilant for that to change. And because these same cartels that smuggle drugs by sea also smuggle fentanyl, Coast Guard drug interdiction operations are essential to disrupting their revenue stream and also fostering information that we can use in criminal investigations to target their activities on fentanyl production and smuggling. Our continued successful drug interdiction and enforcement operations also depend on the readiness of our people and our assets. That's both readiness to operate today and future readiness. Our Coast Guard women and men conduct these operations in a dangerous and unforgiving maritime environment against criminal smugglers who would do them harm. They place themselves at risk to stop illicit narcotics from reaching our streets and harming the American people. We owe it to our workforce to provide them the best leadership, training, and tools to enable them to get the mission done and safely return. I'm grateful for your continued support in this effort. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Burdian.
Good morning, Chair Baldwin. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today. I'm truly honored to represent the women and men of Joint Interagency Task Force South. We're a component of U.S. Southern Command and support the combatant commander's efforts to strengthen partnerships, counter threats, and build the team. According to the Perry Center, 40 of the 50 most violent cities in the world are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Much of that violence is fueled by narcotics smuggling. Transnational criminals disrupt governments and destroy communities and families throughout the Southcom AOR. Good morning, Ranking Member Sullivan. In its 35 years of existence, JADF South has leveraged the authority, jurisdiction, and capability of 5 of the 6 armed services, 13 U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and 20 foreign partners to detect and monitor drug flows in the air and maritime domains throughout our 42 million nautical mile joint operating area. Would you like me to pause for Senator Sullivan? Okay. Our work together enables...
He will follow your testimonies.
Thank you, ma'am. Our work together enables the disruption of narcotics consignments bound for the United States and keeps profit out of the pockets of transnational criminals. Last year alone, we enabled the disruption of 361 narcotic shipments, including the interdiction of over 300 metric tons of cocaine and 78 metric tons of marijuana, valued at more than $7 billion. This work represents over 25% of all known interdictions globally. In 2023, the CDC reported a decline in drug overdoses in the United States for the first time since 2018, but that trend did not apply to cocaine. Last year, more than 29,000 Americans died from cocaine overdose, a number that's comparable to losing a small American town, one that's just smaller than Manitowoc or just about the same size as Juneau, every single year. Cocaine-related deaths were 5 times higher than they were in 2014, when over 5,000 Americans, which was already far too many, lost their lives to cocaine overdose. More than 70% of cocaine overdose deaths involved combining cocaine with an opioid, most often fentanyl. Just as American victims mix their drug of choice, TCOs, transnational criminal organizations, are polydrug enterprises. They traffic plant-based drugs like cocaine and marijuana, synthetic drugs like fentanyl, alongside bulk cash, weapons, and people, and they're driven by a single goal: profit. Although we've not encountered fentanyl in the maritime, our efforts advance investigations into criminal organizations who traffic fentanyl into the U.S. According to the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Forces, last year, 23% of their designated investigations that involved maritime interdictions in the Giant of South Joa were connected to organizations also linked to fentanyl or its precursors. 9% of the investigations were linked to command and control elements of the most prolific international drug trafficking organizations. I just want to emphasize the work Giant of South does advances investigations into organizations who traffic fentanyl into the United States. Partnerships are at the core of our success. We integrate investigative and intelligence data from around the U.S. interagency with information provided by our foreign partners to develop real-time targets that we monitor to turn over to our interdiction partners, like the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard's the largest single provider of U.S. ship days, and those days are augmented using their law enforcement detachments on Allied vessels. We began to use the Ship Special Mission, which is a repurposed commercial vessel under contract by Southcom, in 2017 as a force multiplier to enable partner nation interdictions. In its time in service, the SSM has supported the interdiction of over 40 metric tons of cocaine and marijuana, and moreover, has provided our partners with the expertise and experience to operate far offshore on their own. Today, partner nations contribute over 80% of Giant of South supported interdictions. While we're grateful for the commitment of our foreign partners, U.S. law enforcement agencies benefit most from U.S. interdictions. Simply put, more U.S. interdictions lead to more U.S. prosecutions, initiating a virtuous cycle of success. Information gathered during these interdictions drive further arrests, and each arrest can provide witnesses, cooperators, and new sources of intelligence. This intelligence feeds back into our targeting cycle, leading to more interdictions. In short, we can do more with more. Multiple media outlets have reported a surplus in the global cocaine supply that's driven prices down, increased consumption, and expanded markets into Asia and Europe. This shift highlights the global nature of the threat and the complexity, maturity, and agility of transnational criminal organizations, underscoring the need for an integrated U.S. and international approach to counter-narcotics operations. No U.S. government entity is better poised to combat the threat than Joint Interagency Task Force South. Together, we set the global standard for interagency and international cooperation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Next, I will turn to my ranking member, Senator Sullivan, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. I think it's a really, really important one as it focuses on the maritime drug interdiction issues, which is one element of our strategy that we all need to deal with an issue that's impacting every state in America, and that's the unprecedented drug crisis, especially with regard to fentanyl, that's impacting every state. It's interesting and sad from my perspective, but my state in many ways is the furthest from the southern border, and yet we are facing an unprecedented fentanyl crisis in Alaska. In 2023, opioids killed more Alaskans than ever before. Drug overdose deaths in Alaska, the vast majority of which were fentanyl-related, increased by more than 40% in Alaska, the largest percentage increase of any state in the country. And to combat this, I recently launched an initiative in my state with our governor called the One Pill Can Kill campaign. The point of this campaign is to go out to all Alaskans, especially our youth, to warn them of the threat of taking unprescribed pills. Counterfeit pills are incredibly difficult to spot and can contain deadly amounts of fentanyl. We're seeing this across every state in the country. I do have to say, although we're focused on maritime issues here, the failed open border policies of the Biden-Harris administration have accelerated this disaster. Homeland Security investigations estimates that Mexican cartels, some of which are actually operating in Alaska villages, this notorious Sinaloa cartel is in my state right now, they are now making $13 billion a year smuggling illegal immigrants into the U.S., 26 times what they made in 2018. The mass migration that that the Biden-Harris administration has encouraged and allowed has caused a humanitarian crisis, national security crisis, health crisis, and drug overdose crisis. This crisis is also driven by illegal drug trafficking by transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, as was already mentioned, some of which is being done by maritime means. Last week, Vice Admiral Halsey, the military deputy commander of Southern Command, testified in front of the Armed Services Committee that, quote, transnational criminal organizations remain the primary threat to stability in the entire region. He also said these TCOs, these cartels, get at least 1/3 of their revenue from drug trafficking. Beyond drug smuggling, the TCOs are engaged in arms trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, and many other horrific crimes. Interdicting drug on the high seas is a key to combating the flow of illegal drugs into the United States. And I want to thank the Coast Guard again for all their great work, and other various law enforcement agencies and partner nations around the hemisphere who do this crucial work. It's imperative. However, our challenges are evolving, and we must adapt accordingly. In the 2024 National Drug Threat Assessment, the DEA administrator highlighted the Mexican cartel's reliance on companies in China to supply the pill presses and precursor chemicals needed to manufacture fentanyl that they are using to poison Americans. I recently co-sponsored in the Senate with Senator Tim Scott the Fend Off Fentanyl Act, which was signed into law. This legislation will help stop the flow of deadly fentanyl by directing the Department of Treasury to use economic national security tools to choke off the profits of the Chinese precursor manufacturers and Mexican cartels that push fentanyl across the border. It will help, but until we secure the border, it will not be enough. Finally, Madam Chair, I want to mention one other thing. The Trump administration, the Biden-Harris administration have all announced agreements that they achieved with the communist dictator Xi Jinping that he would reduce the flow of precursor chemicals from China into the United States. As usual, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't keep its commitments to the United States, whether to the Trump administration or the Biden administration. This is what some of us call promise fatigue, where the Chinese consistently commit at the highest levels of government. Think about Xi Jinping and President Obama in the Rose Garden, where Xi Jinping said, we're not going to militarize the South China Sea. They lie. Great powers don't lie, but China does lie all the time, and particularly when it comes to fentanyl. The Congress of the United States, in a bipartisan way, is tired of hearing the Chinese making agreements with Republican administrations, Democratic administrations on fentanyl, and never keeping their word. The Chinese Communist Party is engaging in chemical warfare against the United States. We are tired of it. Hear that, Xi Jinping and the rest of you Communist Party hacks. We need to hold their feet to the fire. Finally, I just want to mention the Coast Guard. Again, you have the biggest fans in the world in my state, the great state of Alaska, with regard to the Coast Guard. We are committed to a recapitalization, a continued recapitalization of the fleet to provide you the resources and the ability to undertake this and the other numerous missions you undertake every single day to save lives in Alaska, in Wisconsin, and everywhere else across the United States. So I want to thank the Coast Guard, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you need from the Congress to be able to do this mission, this critical mission, in a more effective way than you can be doing it now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Next, we're going to hear from Admiral Little.
Good morning, Chair Baldwin, Ranking Member Sullivan. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss the important work of Joint Interagency Task Force West, or JIATF West. JIATF West is Indo-PACOM's Standing Counter-Narcotics Task Force, We utilize Title X authorities to provide Department of Defense capabilities in support of law enforcement counter-drug operations. Comprised of members of the Joint Force, elements of the intelligence community, and U.S. law enforcement, we identify threat networks and share that information with partners to reduce the flow of narcotics in the Indo-Pacific. We specifically target networks associated with drug trafficking, including precursor chemicals used to produce illicit drugs such as methamphetamine and fentanyl. Our priorities are protecting the homeland, strengthening our network of partners, disrupting and degrading threat networks, and countering malign influences in the region. My highest operational priority is identifying and stemming the flow of precursor chemicals, and we've been successful in providing intelligence to support these efforts. Our work has led to the indictment and seizure of illicit drugs and large quantities of precursor chemicals. Additional efforts have supported sanctions against multiple Chinese entities, materially contributing to the production of synthetic opioids. To succeed in our mission, we rely on a network of key partners. Chief among those are the U.S. Coast Guard and JIADF South. We routinely share intelligence and information related to transnational threats that transcend geographic boundaries. As we speak, JIADF West is sharing regionally derived intelligence that is informing active cases in the JIADF South area of responsibility. And these will likely result in Coast Guard interdictions. We also partner with Coast Guard training teams to facilitate instructional courses for international partners who may not have the expertise or resources to effectively fight transnational organized crime. Thank you for the opportunity to share the important work my team at JIADF West does every day, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. And next, Ms. McLoud.
Chair Baldwin, Ranking Member Sullivan, thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss GAO's recent work on federal efforts to counter illicit drugs. Illicit drugs like cocaine and fentanyl and the criminal organizations that traffic them pose significant threats to national security. As you know, Coast Guard is the lead federal agency for maritime drug interdiction. However, it faces significant challenges in carrying out its mission effectively. My testimony today will focus on two main areas. First, key federal maritime coordination efforts to counter illicit drugs, and second, challenges to the service's ability to carry out its missions, including drug interdiction. Regarding federal coordination efforts, the Coast Guard coordinates with the Department of Defense, other DHS components, and participates in joint task forces to enhance drug interdiction efforts. One key example is JIADF South, which coordinates interagency counter-drug operations in the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and Eastern Pacific. Just last week, the Coast Guard, in coordination with JIADF South, offloaded thousands of pounds of cocaine that it seized in the Caribbean. Such seizures demonstrate the value of task force efforts. But our work in 2019 and 2024 has shown that task forces have not consistently assessed their efforts. This is essential for making decisions about priority and resource allocations. We have 9 recommendations to the Coast Guard and others pertaining to task forces that remain unaddressed. Second, the Coast Guard faces asset and workforce challenges that can impact its drug interdiction efforts. The Coast Guard's aging fleet of vessels and aircraft face maintenance and reliability issues. Declining availability of these assets and delays in acquisitions of their replacements can affect the Coast Guard's ability to conduct its drug interdiction mission. Our work has noted that acquisition program delays continue to affect the availability of Coast Guard assets. For example, the Coast Guard's newest cutters, the Offshore Patrol Cutter and the Polar Security Cutter, are intended to support law enforcement missions like drug interdiction and prevention of illegal fishing. But we found that combined, these two programs are billions of dollars over their initial cost estimates and more than 2 years behind schedule. We've made dozens of recommendations in those reports on how Coast Guard can better manage acquisition programs for new vessels and aircraft. Another challenge I'd like to highlight is uncertainty around the Coast Guard's workforce needs. In recent years, the Coast Guard has raised concerns that its mission workload has outpaced its workforce levels. Staffing gaps, particularly in specialized units like tactical law enforcement teams, can hinder drug interdiction efforts. Despite these concerns, Coast Guard has conducted limited assessments of its workforce needs. Specifically, the service reported that it has assessed needs for just 15% of its workforce, a process that it began 20 years ago. The Coast Guard estimates that it is short thousands of service members. Without workforce assessments, it doesn't know the true magnitude of the shortfall and which units or missions are most effective. One of our recommendations from our review is that Coast Guard update its workforce planning document with timeframes and milestones for completing these assessments. Finally, our work has identified challenges related to quality of life factors in healthcare and housing, among others, that may affect the Coast Guard's ability to retain personnel. For example, many Coast Guard stations are located near vacation destinations or in remote areas, which can make it difficult for service members to find available and affordable housing. Earlier this year, we found that the Coast Guard hasn't conducted a survey about members' housing challenges since 2012. We recommended that the Coast Guard do so, which would allow the service to better respond to members' housing needs. In conclusion, while the Coast Guard plays a vital role in maritime interdiction, it faces significant challenges carrying out this mission effectively. Continued coordination with partner agencies will be key as the Coast Guard faces declining asset availability and workforce shortages. Addressing our open recommendations in these areas will help ensure that the Coast Guard is effectively and efficiently using its limited resources to carry out these critical missions. Chair Baldwin, Ranking Member Sullivan, this completes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony and opening statements. Your full statements will be made a part of the record. I'm going to, before we start a round of questioning, I'm going to recognize Chair Cantwell for an opening statement.
Madam Chair, I will put a statement in the record, and if we can go to questions, that would be great.
Absolutely. Your statement, opening statement will be made a part of the record. I want to begin a round of questions. Each member will be given 5 minutes in this opening round. And I want to begin by acknowledging that our nation's effort to counter global drug trafficking requires a whole-of-government approach. While the Office of National Drug Control Policy provides overall direction to these efforts, each participating agency must also have clear goals, partnerships, and resource requirements. Ms. McLoud, can you please describe the Coast Guard's role in disrupting the flow of drugs and precursor chemicals within the National Drug Control Policy, and also what it would mean for the Coast Guard to have its own policy to prevent the smuggling of illicit synthetic drugs such as fentanyl?
The Coast Guard plays an important role in this area. There's no doubt about that. And our work has shown that the collaboration is very strong in these areas, including JIADF South and JIADF West and other task forces. However, our work has shown that the Coast Guard has struggled with foresight and managing towards a future that is different from the past. And I think that would be something important to look at in such a strategy.
Thank you. And Admiral Lunde, if this committee were to direct the Coast Guard to work with its partners and develop such a strategy, what activities would be prioritized, and how would you go about putting together that strategy?
Chair Baldwin, thank you for the question. The Coast Guard's existing strategy exists in the Western Hemisphere strategy, which is about a decade old, and it's principally focused on targeting the transnational criminal organizations that are smuggling into the U.S. We currently operate our counter-narcotics efforts under the 3 national strategies for the northern border, the southwest border, and the southeast border, and our efforts are targeted in those areas under the national strategy. But it is time for us to look at updating that strategy for the Western Hemisphere so it fully aligns with the evolving threat that now includes fentanyl and other synthetic drugs.
Thank you. Admiral Little, I'm interested in discussing with you the challenges of the Indo-Pacific and the work that the Coast Guard assets conduct to disrupt the global fentanyl supply chain. Part of determining how best to allocate resources and identifying where gaps remain involves adequately measuring performance. I notice that in 2019, the Government Accountability Office recommended your organization establish performance measures to track over time. This recommendation was implemented, and now, Admiral Little, can you please discuss what these measures show and about the efforts to track the global movement of precursor chemicals to synthetic drugs and how to improve our approach?
Yes, thank you, Chair Baldwin, for that question. We have looked at that 2019 GAO report and verified, what we did in 2019. And what I will say is I believe our metrics have evolved significantly and improved significantly even from that time to where we are now. What's transpired in the last 4 or 5 years is a defense-wide review. We've had a significant reduction in capacity at GIADF West. And we've evolved as an organization as we've had to reassess where our priorities are. As I mentioned in my opening statement, our number one priority being that of chasing the flow of precursor chemicals into the Western Hemisphere. So we've evolved our evaluation metrics to align with 4 lines of effort to include our number one priority, which is getting after the flow of both fentanyl precursors and the equipment that supports the supply of those things. Underneath that, we have measures of effectiveness and measures of performance in the neighborhood of about 60 specific measures that seek to ensure that we're applying our efforts on our highest priority work and that we're getting the results out of that work to support success. And just one example of that, of those results include increasing the number of interagency partners that we're working with, increasing the amount of cooperation, and significant increases in successful interdictions of precursors.
And on that topic, can you describe how you're increasing cooperation with Mexican partners specifically to stem the flow of precursor chemicals into Mexico? And how is that taking shape?
Yes, thanks, Chair Baldwin. Mexico is a critical partner in stemming the flow of precursor chemicals, particularly in the maritime environment. And as Ranking Member Sullivan mentioned in his opening remarks, the type of flow and the way those chemicals move in bulk into the ports and then into inland Mexico for further production into fentanyl, methamphetamines, or other synthetic opioids. Our role in that is to provide visibility and transparency to U.S. and international law enforcement to understand where are the chemicals, where are they coming from, and where are they headed. When we identify those at risk for diversion, we work very closely with U.S. law enforcement in Mexico City to get that information to CIMAR, the Mexican Navy who controls the ports, so that they can detain those chemicals and conduct further investigations prior to diversion for illicit use.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me follow on that, Admiral Little. Do you have concerns about corrupt Mexican officials in terms of who we're dealing with? Is that part of our problem, that we can't trust our partners?
Our role is directly with U.S. law enforcement, so most of the information that we share will be specific to a load, and then those relationships take place between those partners and the embassy. From our observations, we've had good success with vetted crews and members of CIMAR and other Mexican organizations that we have high trust in.
Okay. And maybe Ms. McLoud or Admiral Lunde, you can address this, but my opening statement made the point that I think is very clear, is that the Chinese make these commitments on precursor chemicals at the highest levels, whether in the Trump administration or with the Biden administration, and it just doesn't seem to go anywhere. Has GAO looked at this at all? Would you agree with me that the commitments they're making, like, it's a dictatorship? If Xi Jinping wanted to go to the precursor chemical people and say, hey, shut it down or you're going to be thrown in jail, like he throws his foreign minister and defense minister and everybody else in jail, he could stop it. So what's your sense of what the Chinese are doing? And clearly they didn't abide by the agreement they had with the Trump administration, and it doesn't look like they're abiding by the agreement they have with the Biden administration. What's your assessment on that?
GAO recently added the drug crisis to our high-risk area, which is an area that we continue to look at all aspects of how to manage the issues that the nation faces. So through this work, we continue to look at the various threats that as they come through. So that's something we have work underway on.
But have you done an assessment on whether or not you think they're abiding by the agreement they did with the Biden administration?
I don't recall that we've done work on that yet.
Maybe you can take a look at that.
I can look into it.
Admiral, have you assessed that at all at your level?
Ranking Member Sullivan, that's not a specific issue that we've looked at in the Coast Guard with respect to high-level agreements between the U.S. and China. But we are, as you know, for the Arctic, close to Alaska, we're very concerned about China's activities in and around the U.S. exclusive economic zone.
Yeah.
And so we're focused on that operational activity.
Let me ask the panel as it relates to that question, or what you just raised. Just in my state, you've seen it last summer, and particularly just in the last 2 months in Alaska, we've had a joint Russian-Chinese naval task force, 7 ships last summer, or 2 summers ago in Alaska waters. Last summer, a joint Chinese naval task force, 12 ships in our waters, a joint Chinese-Russian strategic bomber task force that we, in our AIDAs 2 months ago, actually 6 weeks ago, Chinese surface vessels in our Alaska waters 4 weeks ago, and this past weekend, with this big Russian-Chinese military exercise, 3 AIDAs incursions, right, that we had to go intercept those guys in 1 week. And naval assets off the coast of Alaska, including 2 nuclear subs from Russia, 50 miles off the coast. My question is, the Coast Guard has limited assets. You have gone and shadowed these big operations. But how do you divide that up with the Navy, with Indo-PACOM? The 2 summers ago when we sent one 150-foot Coast Guard cutter to go shadow that 7-ship Russian Naval Joint Task Force off the coast of my state. I love the Coast Guard, but I let senior military officials know that was not sufficient, right? If there was a joint Russian Naval Task Force that large off the East Coast, we would have sent a carrier strike group to go greet it. So last summer when they came back, and they're going to keep coming, right? This is just, they sent a 12-ship Joint Naval Task Force. We did send 4 destroyers, P-8s, and this summer we have a destroyer and a national security cutter up in Alaska shadowing these aggressive operations. But how do you divvy up the Coast Guard DoD assets up in Alaska, where there is so much activity going on with great power competition? And the one thing we do know is if we don't show up with our own force and our own weapon capability, they're going to keep doing this. Would you agree with me on that, Admiral?
Yes, Ranking Member Sullivan, thank you.
How do we divvy up those assets between the Coast Guard and DoD in what's becoming a really, really competitive sphere of competition in the waters and air and subsea off the coast of Alaska?
Ranking Member Sullivan, you mentioned the Coast Guard cutter Stratton's meeting presence with presence this last weekend for the 3 Russian ships. One was a submarine. Now, the Coast Guard is unafraid out there, but we're not alone. All of our activities are fully coordinated with U.S. Northern Command, Indo-Pacific Command, and Alaska Command. And so how we decide to meet presence with presence is fully coordinated, even when the Coast Guard's operating under our own organic Coast Guard authorities. And so we remain in full coordination with them. We also coordinate with our Canadian allies on overflights of Chinese research vessels that may be operating in that area as well. And so this is a sustained operation that we have in place to make sure we meet presence with presence and demonstrate the importance of U.S. sovereignty, not only in our waters, but ensuring that these Russian Navy vessels and the PLA Navy vessels, the Chinese warships, that they are operating consistent with customary international law, and that they know the U.S. is watching.
Do we need more assets up there, Coast Guard or Navy?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Sullivan. We do. As you know, we are working hard to sustain the existing assets we have, while we also look to modernize the Coast Guard fleet by recapitalizing them. Not only our national security cutters, but the new offshore patrol cutter, and ensuring its presence. We have 2 of the new offshore patrol cutters, once they're built, which will be scheduled to be home ported in Kodiak, and then also along the West Coast and other areas, where they'll be able to provide that increased presence.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next I recognize Chair Cantwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to follow along Senator Sullivan's. I would have gotten to this same subject, but since you've gone here, let's go here first. And I'm not sure there's much daylight between Senator Sullivan and I on this issue. When I think about all the attention we give to the South China Sea, how about a little bit of attention in the Arctic? So we are having incursions, correct, by the Russians. Let's just get that,
We have seen the Russians cross into our exclusive economic zone. Yes, Chair Cantwell.
okay. So we know it's happening. And I'm extremely concerned about the fact that President Putin has announced that Russia will allow fishermen to fish in these international waters, which is a direct threat to our seafood sector. And the fact that the Coast Guard is the front line. And so I think we need to know from the Coast Guard what resources you think that we need to have. Now, just to throw in the original focus of drug interdiction, when I look at it over the past decade, the flow of cocaine through the maritime environment has doubled, while the Coast Guard removals have remained flat. And so now that cocaine is being cut with the deadly fentanyl, if the Coast Guard had more ships at its disposal, what could you do to boost those interdiction rates? Now I'm talking all over. And what else do we need to do to increase those interdiction rates? And look, I believe the Coast Guard does many things. You have 5 missions, and we put a lot on you. But I think we're asking, let us go and argue for a more focused approach in the Arctic and a more focused interdiction approach. But you have to tell us what resources you need and what you think that we could do in stopping chemical shipments or stopping traffickers before they get a chance to turn this into deadly narcotics. So I was actually going to ask you, Rear Admiral, but anybody who wants to answer that question.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, and I'll start. Thank you for the question. So we've received great support from the Congress and the administration to make key investments in sustaining our current readiness and modernizing our assets. But as the Commandant's been clear publicly and in testimony, we will need more going into the future. Today, the Coast Guard's discretionary budget is $12.3 billion with a capital improvement budget of $1.6 billion. Going forward, the Coast Guard is a $20 billion organization. We need today a $3 billion capital procurement and improvement budget in order to do the modernization necessary. And the remainder of that, the $16 billion, is needed to sustain our aging assets that we have in place. But that will enable us to deliver new assets, cutters, boats, aircraft, and other systems, along with the people, which are our most precious resource, to be able to provide the presence needed to do those missions.
Well, I definitely could ask lots of questions about Cape D and assets and, their future and missions. But in this regard, does the Coast Guard have a draft out of that $3 billion that would be necessary for a larger Arctic presence for both the incursions that are happening by the Russians, the threats of the Chinese pretending to be an Arctic nation when they're not an Arctic nation, and to help in the interdiction? Do you have a proposal within that $3 billion?
Chair Cantwell, we do have, in addition to the FY25 President's budget request, we also have an unfunded priority list that identifies items for increased purchase of spare parts for our aging cutter fleet, also parts for our aviation fleet, both fixed wing and helicopters, as well as increased funding for the recapitalization of assets to be able to accelerate the work that we need to do.
could we get a plan from the Coast Guard on what would increase your interdiction capacity to try to address the fact that we've seen this huge increase in supply and not as much interdiction? So we want to help you get the assets. And then separately, I'd like to see a number that is, what would a larger, I don't know what Senator Sullivan would call it, you know, the Russians are going to continue to provoke, but what we want to do is to have, as you described it, a presence there, and to be serious about, you know, I mean, we have fishermen up there that the fleet, Russian fleet, are coming up next to fishing vessels. So we want to know what that plan would look like out of the $3 billion too. So more interdiction writ large, and more capacity in the Arctic, meeting, as you described, presence with presence. If we could get what of your $3 billion proposal would be addressing either of those, and if that's not crisp, if you could get us something that is crisp, because I think Senator Sullivan and I plan to continue to communicate about this issue. And so, and Chair Baldwin, thank you for having the hearing to begin with and getting all of us here to talk about this. So could I get a commitment, Admiral, for that plan?
Thank you, Chair Campbell. Yes, we will follow up with briefings and information for the record in response to your questions.
Thank you.
Next, we have Senator Blackburn.
Madam Chairman, thank you so much. And I want to thank you for the hearing today. I think that looking at what is happening on the world stage with the cartels and the drug trafficking, the human trafficking, is something that we're continuing to see more of. And the fact that these precursor chemicals seem to be coming in by the container load, as one of our Tennessee sheriffs said, when they apprehend drugs now, they used to apprehend things in grams and now it's all in pounds. So we appreciate what the Coast Guard does. Admiral, I do have a question about the budget justification that states that failing to achieve counter-drug performance measures was due to a decrease in the number of surface assets due to reallocation to migrant interdiction operations. And we know that a decade ago that the Coast Guard would interdict 15% of estimated cocaine maritime drug flows. And in 23, the numbers were 3.6%. So do you continue to see a reduction? Do you expect to continue to see a reduction in drug interdiction because of the illegal migrant flows?
Senator Blackburn, thank you for your question. So I was the Atlantic Area Commander for the Coast Guard in 2023. As I took command in 2022, we were beginning to see an uptick in irregular maritime migration from Haiti and from Cuba, moving in the South Florida Straits and off the Windward Pass towards South Florida. So I made the decision, after notifying the Commandant, that we were going to begin to shift major Coast Guard cutters, aircraft, and personnel from the counter-drug mission, which is about saving lives and protecting our border, but over to the effort to stop the irregular maritime migration toward the U.S., which is also about saving lives and protecting our border. Our mission there, which is conducted in a task force, a Department of Homeland Security task force, is to prevent a maritime mass migration that, would it occur, would present a national security threat to the U.S. The last time that happened was in 1994 from both Haiti and Cuba. And so we surged assets starting in August of 2022 to prevent that from happening, maintaining a higher than 80% at-sea interdiction rate. And again, our mission is to interdict those ventures, those migrant ventures, as far from U.S. shores as possible, and then rapidly repatriate them to their country of origin. So it's a life-saving and a border control mission. And over the last 2 years, we've been successful in preventing a maritime mass migration. We will always have a presence to prevent that pressure against the U.S. southeast border. And now we've begun in the last several months to shift those major cutters back to the drug interdiction mission working for Admiral Burdian at Joint Task
Okay,
Force
let
South.
me, not to interrupt, but I do want to ask you this. Going back to February 23, when you started to see a, an, an uptick and a skyrocketing in the numbers of the illegal migrants, you had two senior members of the Coast Guard that wrote an article, and they talked about the migrant interdiction operations were in a state of emergency. So what, tell me where you put the number to say we are now in a state of emergency, and how many a day, a week, a month, a year? What are you facing? You have referenced twice when you got to that state of emergency. Oh, so are we still in what you would classify as state of emergency?
Thank you for the question, Senator Blackburn. So under our plan, which is a Homeland Security plan that we lead, we entered a surge phase for prevention of a mass migration. So it's not, emergency was not a term we were using at the time, but we were seeing a historic surge in irregular maritime migration. And so we took an urgent approach to address that.
Okay, let me ask you this, because with some of the migrants, these illegal aliens that come to the southern border, or you are interdicting them at sea, we know that there are gang members, Tren de Agua, TDA, the Venezuelan gang. You also have MS-13. These are dangerous people. So what are you doing to protect our men and women in uniform so that they are going to be safe as they are handling these instances?
Thank you, Senator. So first, we make sure that our people, our Coast Guard men and women that are conducting this mission and encountering migrants at sea are well-trained and that they have the equipment they need to be able to process and then repatriate those migrants safely, and then continue to treat each person we encounter with dignity and respect until we know their background. And we do collect biometrics. That's an expansion of the capability that we had. We started that in 2023. So we better understand who we are encountering at sea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we have Senator Budd.
I thank the chair and I thank the panel for being here. Admiral Lunde, I'd like to ask you for a status update. As you know, there's an ongoing environmental emergency in Buxton Beach, North Carolina, which is part of the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. And before 2013, the Navy and Coast Guard, they stored fuel at the beach. And it used to be buried, but now oil's washing onto the beach and leaking into the ocean. Folks in the area are rightly concerned and frustrated because it's gone on for more than a year. There are three primary federal agencies with responsibility here. It's the National Park Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Coast Guard. Now, I know that the Coast Guard is working with the other relevant agencies, and then the Army Corps of Engineers recently announced they're deploying a team to monitor and take potential actions if petroleum releases are observed. But is the Coast Guard involved with these efforts?
Senator Budd, thank you for the question. I first became aware of this issue when I was commanding Atlantic area last year, and I began to receive emails directly from local residents and community members in the area and in Buxton. And so I became familiar with the issue and what we were doing, working with the National Park Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Navy. And we continue to be involved in those efforts. As you noted, Senator, I noted that the Corps of Engineers last Friday deployed a team to begin removing potentially contaminated soil, and they announced that they awarded a contract to bring in additional equipment to begin to remediate some of the potentially contaminated soil in the area. But the Coast Guard remains fully involved in that and in coordination with the Corps, with the National Park Service, and the Navy.
So you do agree that there is an active spill? And first of all, thank you for your efforts through the Coast Guard on this, but you do agree there's an active spill?
Well, Senator, we sent Coast Guard pollution responders earlier in the year and last year to determine whether or not we could take action as if it was an oil spill into the water. As we arrived on scene, we did not detect the level of, or detect any spill that we could respond to under our authorities. That didn't mean there was nothing that could be done, because there are other authorities that the Army Corps and others are using and that we're leaning on to be able to address the problem. But at the time and in our response, we have not seen an active spill that enabled us to use our organic Coast Guard oil spill response authorities.
Has the Coast Guard determined whether there's an authorized program it can use to remediate the site?
Well, we're working with the Corps of Engineers and the Park Service to look at that, Senator. And so that's part of a federal team effort to address the challenges there.
One more question on the authorities. Would it be possible for the Coast Guard's oil cleanup authorities to be used here, since petroleum is washing into the ocean? I just want to be clear on this.
Senator, although we haven't seen oil washing into the ocean specifically, but if we do detect that, our oil spill response authorities could be used. So we are continually in communication with not only the federal partners, but with the local community. And if there is oil going into the water, we will respond under that oil spill response authority. Yes, sir.
Again, I know there's multiple agencies involved here. How long, in your best estimation, would it be before those that are concerned, all of us in North Carolina concerned about this, how long do you think it can be before we expect that these are all cleaned up?
Senator, I would like to get back to you with a briefing along with the Corps of Engineers so we can fully answer that question and provide that for the record, sir.
Thank you. I would ask the Coast Guard to keep working, as you are, with every other involved party to end this environmental emergency now. This needs to be cleaned up without further delay. And again, I want to thank you for your efforts through the Coast Guard. I want to ask you a question related to what Senator Blackburn was talking about with drug trafficking. And this is regarding trafficking in the Middle East, including drugs trafficked on the fishing dhows. It has been, they've been used to finance Iran's malign activities. If the Coast Guard is, if your assets are operating in the CENTCOM AOR and you discover illegal narcotics aboard a vessel, what happens to those narcotics and to the crew that is attempting to traffic those illegal narcotics?
Thank you for the question, Senator Budd. Our forces over there, and we have almost 400 Coast Guard men and women and 6 Coast Guard cutters permanently stationed there. They operate under the command and control of U.S. Central Command and then 5th Fleet Naval Central Forces under the command of Admiral Wyckoff. So they're performing a Department of Defense mission. Now, I don't represent the Department of Defense today, Senator, but in my experience as a force provider to them, our crews typically, when they encounter a dhow, one of these vessels that is smuggling drugs, we will destroy the drugs at sea, gather information about the master and the crew of the vessel, and then we'll disembark the vessel.
Thank you, Admiral. This is a yes or no question. Is it fair to say that these would-be drug traffickers face no other punishment other than having their drugs seized?
In my experience in that scenario, that's correct, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to start a second round of questioning and go a little bit out of order to allow Senator Sullivan to go first because he has another appointment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just have one final question. It's an important one. So, as Senator Cantwell mentioned, the Russians have announced that they're going to stop even abiding by EEZ rules when they're fishing, and they're going to go into other people's EEZs. This is in line with other dictatorships like the Chinese with their IUU fishing. Senator Whitehouse and I have been working on a bipartisan bill dealing with IUU fishing that would target China, primarily with more naval and Coast Guard assets. My question, Admiral, maybe you can take it, or anyone else from JIATIS West or South, because it's IUU is a giant issue all over the world, particularly with these Chinese gray fleets, is that in addressing the IUU fishing problem in our fish bill, that's the name of our bill, to address IUU fishing, which the Coast Guard helped us write, provides assets, but tying that problem back to the topic of today's hearing, is there overlap in terms of assets and efforts and resources that can be used in the counter-drug mission that can also be used in combating IUU fishing, particularly as it relates to Chinese use of precursors on the drug issue, and the Chinese fleets being the biggest violators of IUU fishing in the world. Admiral, maybe take a crack at that, and then anyone else.
Thank you, Ranking Member Sullivan. It's an important question, and I thank you for your support to strengthen the Coast Guard's tools and the federal government's tools to address the problem of IUU fishing, a global problem, but one that actually impacts our seafood industry as well. And so I thank you for the additional tools. In terms of a cross-connect between what we may be seeing in IUU fishing and drug interdiction or the drug problem, we're looking closely at that. We see these distant water fishing fleets travel around the world, stay persistently at sea, and engage in IUU fishing, and that destabilizes maritime nations that are trying but may not have the capability to protect their own waters. And that could be a connection to challenges to movement of drugs and other malign activities. So it's an area we're focused on.
Great. Well, we want to continue to work with you on that because they're both really important topics. And again, Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing, and I appreciate you letting me cut in line.
No problem. I want to go back to drill down a little deeper on some of the asset and resourcing issues. So as we've heard discussed already, more cocaine is entering the country now compared to 5 to 10 years ago. And in fact, the flow of known cocaine into America has doubled over the last decade, while the amount interdicted by the Coast Guard has remained flat over the same period of time. The Coast Guard has not met its mission performance target for cocaine interdiction once in the past 10 years. So I want to start with you, Admiral Burdian. Cocaine is primarily trafficked in your areas of operation. And it's now, as we know, frequently being cut with fentanyl, leading to tragic losses across America. I'm concerned that we're not resourcing the Coast Guard sufficiently to address that threat. And so just how much additional cocaine could be stopped from reaching this country if your organization received additional Coast Guard sea and air assets as well as personnel? And is there a specific Coast Guard asset whose shortage most affects your mission?
Thank you for the question, Chair Baldwin. I'm proud to say that today we do have 6 Coast Guard cutters operating under the tactical control of GIADF, operating between the Eastern Pacific and in the Caribbean, as well as a law enforcement detachment on board an allied vessel. So we have seen a restoration of those forces in support of GIADF South's detection and monitoring mission. While I couldn't speak to how much more is enough, there really is no replacement for U.S. Coast Guard law enforcement capabilities and authorities in the GIADF South JOA. When the Coast Guard conducts an interdiction, we not only remove those narcotics from the water, but the pocket litter, the electronics, that intelligence is exploited by those crews, and the individuals who are involved in the smuggling effort are brought back to the United States, to the Department of Justice for prosecution. And that work really contributes to the broader U.S. effort to dismantle the transnational criminal organizations who are conducting the trafficking. I would like to mention also, we have 6 partner nations contributing their forces in the Eastern Pacific, and another 6 partner nations and an allied partner operating in the Caribbean. And they're doing extraordinary work. I mentioned they contribute to 80% of the 307 metric tons that were interdicted, supported by GIADF South last year. And they are providing some information. They give us biometrics. They exploit the pocket litter, and that goes into U.S. databases for our use. But more Coast Guard cutters are vital to the effort. And the best Coast Guard cutters, the national security cutters, we've got 2 of them in the JOA right now, are exceptional assets. Their ability to deploy law enforcement teams, utilize airborne use of force, the stability, the seakeeping of those assets is simply irreplaceable. The medium endurance cutters who do come down to the joint operating area, they do tremendous work. Those crews are working so hard, and I value all of them, but it's difficult. They're operating aging assets that break frequently, and their embarked airborne capability is then not usable. We lose ship days to the need to conduct emergency maintenance and repair on those assets. The fast response cutters, when we do get them down in the joint operating area, those are the newer 154-foot patrol boats, are also extraordinary. I think the data would tell you they're about 40% more effective than the medium endurance cutters. However, part of the package that's necessary to interdict these fast-moving assets is that airborne use of force capability from the Coast Guard Helicopter Interdiction Squadron. So best for us is a functioning, trained crew who comes in with an airborne use of force helicopter, a surface use of force capability that can deliver that law enforcement with those highly trained boarding teams.
Thank you. And Admiral Lunde, can you describe for the committee how the Coast Guard balances risks and competing priorities when allocating assets between the counter-drug mission and other missions? And you were just describing a little bit about the need to do some of that pivoting with regard to Haiti and Cuba, when you describe the surge in maritime migration and the mission to prevent that.
Thank you, Chair Baldwin. The top mission for the Coast Guard is, that is our North Star, is search and rescue and then ensuring the operation and defense of our marine transportation that is so vital to our economic prosperity and national security. And so we have not taken any reduction in the level of commitment to forces and operations to ensure we perform those missions. As you know, we have a 10% shortage in our enlisted workforce, the backbone of our force. And so because of that, we've had to take actions to lay up 3 of our 210-foot cutters and 7 patrol boats because we didn't have enough Coast Guard men and women to crew them. Now, we're making progress on recruiting, and I can talk about that, but the cutters we've laid up would have otherwise been operating and conducting drug interdiction operations or other high-priority operations that we've been discussing.
And Ms. McLoud, from your vantage point as a subject matter expert, can you provide an assessment of what new technology or updates to existing platforms would yield significant improvements in the Coast Guard's drug interdiction mission?
Yes, thank you. Technology is critical for Coast Guard operations. However, the Coast Guard has a long history of problems managing these resources. Our work has highlighted many areas. We currently have more than 50 open recommendations to the Coast Guard to help them manage resources. These include workforce planning, delayed acquisitions, and shore infrastructure resources, all of which are key to carrying out their missions, including drug interdiction.
Thank you. I look forward to receiving progress reports on the Coast Guard's workforce assessments and the Government Accountability Office's recommendations, and I look forward to working with all of you to train and equip the people who defend our shores. With that, the hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During that time, senators may submit questions for the record. Upon receipt, witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible, but by no later than Thursday, October 3rd. I thank the witnesses for appearing today, and this hearing is now adjourned.